Yesterday, I had 2 conversations with the President of France, and even until 2 a.m., and he assured me that the American position has had certain changes. But when I asked what they were, he couldn't answer. So I believe we first need to understand what these changes are, if there are any, because your colleague, on the contrary, publicly, even yesterday, said that no concessions on the matters of principle concerning the expansion of NATO and the possible admission of other members, including Ukraine, are not there. There'll be no concessions. Well, Mr. Putin, despite many media reports in the West of the so-called secret documents that were discussed between the West with us and between themselves in the 90s and since then, what is clear is there was in the narrow circle, there was no intention to expand to the east. But despite that, Mr. Stoltenberg, who is now the NATO Secretary General, rejects the obvious fact, which has been declassified from the British archives and published in Der Spiegel. And despite all that, they insist on the inadmissibility of even softening the open door policy, although you have explained many times that there is no such policy, but there is the possibility under the Washington Treaty, with the agreement of all NATO members, to offer this or that country join the alliance under 2 terms, if it suits the criteria, meets the membership criteria, and if it adds to the security of the NATO alliance. And the second criteria has been ignored for a long time. We know that. But as for what new ideas the Americans can present to us, we proceed from what you told Macron, that we first need to understand what they mean. And since our French colleagues are giving us the information that they do have some understanding of what Washington can talk to us about, today, as you agreed with President Macron yesterday, I have a telephone conversation with the French foreign minister, and when we were agreeing a time for the conversation, I asked the foreign ministry of France to make sure that this conversation clarifies what specifically the Americans are ready to discuss, as the French have hinted.
Part of the broader discussion that took place in that about future Ukrainian NATO membership, he said, Vladimir Putin mentioned that he'd spoken to Emmanuel Macron, the French president, over the weekend, and the suggestion there was that America's position on the future of Ukrainian NATO membership may have adjusted. He used the phrase certain changes, according to the translation, but that when he asked Emmanuel Macron what changes he was citing, they were not specified. The backdrop, of course, to this, John, is a potential meet between President Biden and President Putin on the condition that no invasion takes place. What do you make of whether or not the position perhaps has changed in light of the option, at least, for the 2 leaders to meet?
I've heard nothing, Julia, to make me believe that the position has changed. I think Putin's playing word games here. It has been acknowledged by the President of the United States, as well as leaders of NATO, that Ukraine is not close to meeting the conditions to become a part of NATO. The open door policy remains that if a country wants to join, and if they can meet the requirements, NATO will have them. That exists for Ukraine, and the United States and NATO have insisted they're not changing the open door policy. As a real world matter of fact, they're not close to joining. And so if Vladimir Putin wants to say that that is a moratorium on their membership, that's a term that he can apply to it. And if that is something that provides face saving for him, I'm sure the White House will be delighted for him to glom onto that. But the United States has made clear for a while NATO can join if they meet the requirements, but they're not close to meeting those requirements. And so there is some gray zone in there in which 2 sides could come to some sort of a combination, the United States not saying we're not letting them in, but recognizing that that's not going to happen soon. That might be something that Putin would want to glom onto.
The mention of the separatists, the breakaway regions, and the fact that they are now considering the request from the two leaders of these regions for independence.
Yeah, a request that was repeated in a television address today from the leaders of both of these breakaway republics. Now, these republics have frequently kind of raised the issue or hope that they might in some way be recognized an independent state. It's something that the states, plural, it's something that the Russian Duma has considered. Amidst this, as you rightly point out, Julia, a very staged process of discussion with his National Security Council, Putin is trying to lay out not only the history, but the justification for what may come next. Now, it's still ongoing. He's unlikely to reach any public decision, notably not over, I suspect, the future dispensation for those two so-called breakaway republics. But they are pointing out, his defense minister there, Shoigu, pointing out that in his view there was an increase in the number of attacks. There have been 59,000 Ukrainian troops gathered on the line of contact, which is essentially the front line between the two sides. A huge number of tanks he referred to, and allegations that artillery is being fired from Ukrainian government territory into rebel territory. All of the above is denied very explicitly, I have to insist, by the Ukrainian government. We have also seen precious few Ukrainian troops beyond those naturally expected to be holding those frontline positions. But of course, the Ukrainians do have maneuvers going on throughout the country in preparation for what the United States, the United Kingdom in particular, has again repeated today that they believe is an invasion that has already been ordered by Vladimir Putin, and that even at a tactical level, commanders are being warned off that they should be conducting the last checks before some kind of H hour is reached. Now, we also have to treat that intelligence with a degree of skepticism. It may indeed also be intelligence that the Russians have deliberately fed into the Western minds. But in all of this theatre, this grand strategy theatre, what exactly is Putin's agenda? Is it really to wind back Ukraine's attempts to join NATO? Is it really to see the architecture of European security structures wound back to 1997? Or more likely, frankly, is it to see Ukraine permanently destabilized so that it can't stand as a pro-Western successful democracy and an example to its neighbor, one Russia? Julia?
What we heard from the FSB chief there was highly emotive. He talked about an intensification of the shelling from Ukraine into two of these breakaway regions. He talked about shelling that was prepared and targeted, that a bus stop was hit and a miner lost their life. He talked about 68,500 refugees leaving by 9 a.m. this morning, Russia time, leaving these breakaway regions, moving into Russia because they saw a danger to the population. Highly emotive statements that are being made, and much of which has been denied by Ukrainian officials.
Yeah, it's been denied by Ukrainian officials. It's also, some of it, been investigated by CNN. So, for example, we've been able to examine the metadata made when the two leaders of the two breakaway republics appealed for their populations to evacuate. We discovered that those appeals were actually made 2 days before they were broadcast. There's also a good deal of analysis going on into some of the allegations outlined by the Russian side of, for example, an artillery strike on a border post actually in Russian territory, with the allegation that the Ukrainians fired a missile of some kind into a border post. That is currently being examined, and it looks, shall we say, fishy. Equally, the Russians have claimed that they knocked out 2 armoured vehicles that were part of an attempted incursion as part of this series of sabotage efforts. Again, the Ukrainians have flatly denied any kind of incursion into Russian territory. Indeed, they are saying that they are very, very limited to 0 Ukrainian artillery barrages being fired into the Donbass region because their troops on the ground have got orders not to be provoked into the sort of action that could, heaven forbid, if it resulted in mass casualties, provide an excuse ultimately for a Russian invasion. But remember who Vladimir Putin is talking to. Is he staging this for the international community? Is he got his National Security Council out in public, walking them through all of these arguments, the long involved discussions about the hopelessness in the Russian view of any future discussions over the so-called Minsk agreements? Is he addressing his own people, or is he, more importantly, addressing his own military so that they are motivated to do what they have to do if he finally does give that order to invade?